you had read Richard Carrier's book, Sense and Goodness Without God, and you did an Amazon review, and then you interacted specifically with his claim that Christianity was spread by the sword. And so recently on Facebook, you actually reshared this. It says, 12 years ago, I dismantled Richard Carrier's claims that Christianity spread by the sword, and it only or primarily prospers under threat of force. Some people found that article helpful, and such falsehoods still are told, so let me provide that link again. And I said, man, this is a perfect time to interview David, so let's go. And people did find the article helpful. Many, many years ago.
Yeah, somebody had made the same point again, so I looked up that old article and said, well, this answers the challenge that some skeptics still present for Christianity.
Nice. Well, I hope it's all right. I want to ask some questions about this and see where we go. What's the we'll call it the 30-second answer? Did Christianity spread by the sword? What's the short version of that?
You can do that in 3 seconds, not usually.
Okay. What's a fact about this topic that people usually don't hear that they need to?
Usually people concentrate on a couple of examples of Christians doing bad things, which of course in 2,000 years of history always find. But actually I would say that often Christianity has spread, you could say, against the sword. Persecution by people who wanted to exterminate it or want to restrict them away. So there were a few instances. I break it down into 12 distinct, you could say, cultural circles or eras in which Christianity has in fact spread. A lot of people became Christians. We have to define exactly what that means. And of those 12, there were 2 periods in which there was a certain amount used in order to not exactly to help the gospel spread. And 10 of them not at all, and even of those 2, it's a little bit iffy. Didn't happen too often.
What's something that you have introduced in your work that you've seen help people change their mind about this topic if they're misinformed?
Well, one of the people who responded to it was from the Philippines, and he said this is a very common challenge that Christians in the Philippines, because of course the Philippines were under Spanish rules, was South America. I'm not a South American, I'm more of an Asian scholar, so I can't pretend to be an expert in the history of Spanish colonialism in Argentina or Mexico or whatnot. That's probably the best case for this argument that Christianity was spread violently. Now, of course, this is important is because we're often rather naive about evangelism or apologetics. We think that we care about what's true, and that's really what's going to change people's mind. All we have to prove that God exists, prove that Jesus was the Son of God and he rose from the dead. But people don't necessarily think that way. What people really care about is this good for us? And not just good for me, like to die and I'm going to go to heaven because I received Jesus as my personal Savior, but how about my family? How about my people? Is this going to help us or hurt us? And so if you say that Christianity is harmful and it was spread by the sword, it may not hurt me personally, but it's going to hurt me and going to say that Christianity would be true. And secondly, why should we as a people believe? Because thousands of years ago, God allegedly promised Abraham that his seed would be sent to all the world. Well, this is part of that. Has the gospel been a blessing or to humanity? In some ways, this is an even more important question than, can I prove that Jesus really rose from the dead? In my work, I've addressed both sides of the coin. I've talked about the historicity of the Gospels. I've written on the reality of God and why we can believe that God exists and why we can believe that who we say that he is. I'm thinking about writing about the resurrection as well. I write about evidences for the truth of the gospel in others as well, in Chinese and Indian and other cultures like. So I strongly believe those are very important questions that need to be addressed. But this question for a lot of people in the world in general comes even before that. If people perceive Christianity as harmful to their people, to their traditions, to the culture that they love, they're not going to listen to your evidences for Christ.
Right, because the cost is too great if that's what it's coming in just to destroy. Walsh in the live chat says he always answers with, well, what century are we talking? Do you think that's a good question to ask when having this discussion?
Well, I'm an historian, so I'm going to talk about every century.
And so when you add it all up, you would say not usually. Okay, so
Yeah.
what's the main mistake that critics make in regards to this when they say that Christianity was spread by the sword? What would you say their main mistake is?
No history. They don't know the facts. Usually they'll hit on a few. Well, let me put this a little more broadly. One of the main errors that people make about any kind of historical claim, whether it's how Christianity has impacted women, which is the book that I've just written, or so many questions, people tend to cherry pick politics, opinion about politics. They have an opinion about, should the United States have attacked Iran, for example, and then whatever their opinion to be, they'll cherry pick the evidence that they think is going to support their. And that's the way people often do. That's the way people often answer this question is say, okay, I see this example of Christians being mean, this example of people in the government of 1513, for example, when the Spanish basically imposed Christianity on some peoples in South America, or they look at examples from, for example, Charlemagne in the Middle Ages and how he persecuted the Saxons to be baptized. Find a few examples like that, and they think that's a good enough argument because you find examples to support your case. So the biggest mistake that people make on either side of the question is to not look at the picture, but to just pick pieces of evidence that support their views.
B-Boy Drew says, regarding this question, what was the worst era in Christianity? Maybe some of the examples he gave. Which was the worst?
Well, this is kind of interesting. And again, I don't claim to be a Latin scholar, but it's the people of Central and South America had some bad luck, and you could include North America in that, in two ways. They had two pieces of bad luck. Number one, the Spanish arrived in 1491, specifically Columbus. This was the beginning of what was called the Columbian Exchange, when things went east and west. Everything that was connected with Eurasia came to North and South America, and everything that South America had developed went to Eurasia and Africa, which meant food went in directions, but also diseases. And the bad luck of it for the Indians was that a lot of very terrible diseases arrived in the Americas, like smallpox and many other diseases, and basically killed off 80 to 90% of the people. Even before white arrived, and vast stretches of North America were basically empty because of these epidemics. So that was the first really bad luck on the part of the Americans when the West met. The second was the Spanish. Ferdinand and Isabella had just conquered the last outpost, Islam, in Iberia, I think the very year that Christopher Columbus sailed to the Americas. So for 5 years, the Reconquista, Christian, quote unquote, Christian forces had been trying to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula in a long, long time. And one of the results was, I think, and I think there's some evidence for this as well. Again, I don't claim to be an expert on this. The attitude, the fighting spirit, the cruelty of that 5-year battle rubbed off on the people who went to the Americas. And they were indeed often extremely ill. Now, according to the law, the Spanish requirement of 1513, they was to give people a choice in whether or not they believed Christianity. They had to read something. They had to read this requirement before they conquered them, and basically said, if you surrender right now, we're not going to be slaves of you. And we won't conquer your lands anymore. You have to obey us, and because this is going to be part of, the Spanish territory. And you don't necessarily need a Christian, but you have to listen to Christianity. Now, when they read this requirement, they didn't necessarily have to speak in the language of in the Americas. They could just read it off a ship. They didn't really care. It's just as so long as they read this sermon, then it was okay to go ahead and conquer whichever people they felt like they could conquer. So in that initial period of quest, I would say that was probably the worst. There were incidences in Europe and also in Goa, in India, a little outpost of the Spanish Empire in Goa. So there were some incidents here in different parts of the world that you could say, yeah, in these cases, the Christians were pretty brutal.
Brother Walsh wonders if it was the Inquisition. That's one time that was brought up here, which, of course, would somewhat relate to what you said about Spanish.
I'd say the psychology of the era probably has something to do with Inquisition, although whenever we talk about the brutality of the Middle Ages, we also remember the brutality of the 20th century. You know, if we think bad, just imagine what they would say about us if they looked at the Nazis and the communists and whatnot in the 20th century and what they did. It's vastly, vastly worse than anything like the Inquisition. I don't know exactly. There's some ironies in the Inquisition because in some cases, for example, the witch hunts are less severe in Spain than they were in other parts of Europe. The Inquisition wasn't necessarily as harsh, secular rule in some cases. So we get our picture a lot from Fyodor Dostoevsky, of course, when he was Grand Inquisitor in the Brothers Karamazov, which is one of the greatest of literature in all Western literature. But so I guess my answer would be I think there is some connection, but exactly how close the connection would be. I think the Inquisition was actually part of the Reconquista. The Christians were trying to reconquer the territory of Spain, and so the Inquisition was in part to root out Muslims and secret Jews. Even with the Crusades, for example, when the Crusaders went off to conquer Jerusalem, this is a very common phenomena in sociology. When two opposing plates, spiritual or social tectonic plates, like Islam and Christianity, very often, before you attack your main enemy, you attack some minority that you perceive as dangerous within your own society. Before the Crusaders went off to the Holy Lands, Prince Amico led a group of rather pagan Christians attacking Jews along the Rhine in different parts of Germany. So there were pogroms against the Jews before the Crusaders went off Holy Land and I think in some ways that was kind of a reflection less of Christianity than it was of, they were inspired by Islam in some ways. I really think that's true. I think that the Islamic, because the Muslims had been attacking the Christendom for some 400 years by that time, and it's very common for one society to learn from a strong society, to be influenced by a stronger society in how they act. So if you read, for example, the Song of Roland about the battle between the Christians and the Muslims in Spain, in some ways it sounds a lot like Islam. The description of the religion that the Christians held sounds more like Islam than Christianity in some ways. I think they were deeply influenced by the enemy that they've been fighting for so many hundreds of years. That's partly explains the brutality with which they conquered the New World. But they were pushed back. Like Bartolome de las Casas, he went with these conquerors, with the conquerors, and he realized that it was really a terrible thing they were doing, and he fought whole life to ameliorate the condition for the Indian people, for the Indians, for the native peoples of the Americas. Actually, he had some impact on changing the way people thought and the law so that the Native American people would not be forced to believe against their will, and also would have a little bit more freedom, not be enslaved.
Well, excellent. David, are you able to real quick click off and then click back on? There's a couple times when you're talking, the audio is breaking up. I don't know if it's the position where we're at in the office, but I want to see if we can reestablish a connection. Would that be okay? I'm going to just do it and then jump back in. I'm going to go out and then come back in if we could, okay? Let's try that. Let me see here. We are talking to author David Marshall here. And the question is, how is Christianity spread? By the sword. And Brother Haram is here, and he made some interesting comments I want to share. My mother recently passed away January 30th. Sorry for your loss, brother, but thank you for sharing, and we're glad you're here with us. She was 3/4, 75% Comanche. As an indigenous man, I resent Christianity and what it has done throughout history, the bad part of it anyway. Understand that perspective, and thank you for sharing. And he says, thank you for having this discussion. Vocab, thank you. God bless from Cache, Oklahoma. And then Daughter of Galatians says, Christianity did my country some good. I am from New Zealand. The missionaries brought my people the Bible. Condolences for your loss. And then we have debate of everything present. My clan converted to Christianity when a priest promised us if we carried the cross into battle, we would defeat the large invading army. I think the priest was just lucky. The priest was Catholic. The invaders were Methodists. And looks like you have a picture of Sam Harris there. And Nate asked, why does my voice sound pitched up? I do not know. It's strange because when I go to listen on my phone, it doesn't seem that way. So I don't know if you're able to try to reestablish a connection and check that out. I'm not sure what's up with that, brother. But let's continue to talk to David Marshall, and we're going to take a quick detour since he's rejoining us back. And this relates, he's mentioned this briefly, to talk about his new book as well. We're talking about Christianity being spread by the sword. But David, you have a new book about how Jesus liberated women, right? That's, I believe, the title indeed. And I think you were even maybe going to do maybe 2 volumes. Can you talk about this new work you've been involved with?
Yeah, the book is called How Jesus Has Liberated Women. And I'll tell you how I got started on this, if you don't mind my explaining this personally. Because I'm not a woman, you may have noticed. Not always something you can take for granted these days, but I am in fact. When I was a young man, I grew up in a Christian family. When I was a young man, I joined an organization called Youth of the Mission for a short time. And we went to a place in Thailand where the missionary took us to different tribal villages. And, I don't know, it was Lahu or Lisu village he took us to one day. He told us the backstory before we went there. He said that the year before they had come to the village and they stayed because of rainstorm. People in the village said, you guys want to for the night? And of course they were horrified. We came back the next year, and this is what we encountered was young women were being, sold at a very cheap price for the pleasure of foreign visitors, packers. And we set up to do a present the gospel of the life of Jesus in front of this bamboo hut village. And I wasn't part of the presentation. It was a kind of a drama. I went behind the hut and praying for the presentation, praying for the presentation of the gospel. And while I was praying, I felt as if God were speaking to me. And I started because I felt like as if God were saying, just as I sent my son into the world to give his life for the world, in the same way I want to send my children into this village, into this town, into this tribe to save these people. So for the next several years, I tried to help women, more in Taiwan than in Thailand, who were forced into the sex trade. So that's really where I became interested in this subject, although it was only in writing my book about the new atheism that a lot of new atheists strongly believe that Christianity has harmed women. So over the last 13 years, it actually began with a challenge from a guy named John Loftus, who's an atheist and is one of the new atheists. And he explained on his blog that the reason why he Christianity, because his blog is called Deconstructing Christianity or something, was because of what it does to women. John, I challenge you to a debate, because he suggested we write a book with it at one point. We have debated a couple times. I believe that nothing liberated women more than an example of Jesus Christ. That was about 13 years ago. I'm writing my books ever since then, and I've finished one of them now. It's volume 1, Before Christ. how Jesus has liberated women before Christ. And then the second volume is going to tell more of the story since then, from the life of Jesus on. A tremendous adventure for this because, I'm telling a story that I don't think has ever been told that really goes back to the dawn of the human race. And, why are we male and female to begin? Why do we join in a family? What does it mean to be a man, mean to be a woman? All these challenges are still with us. We often talk about the sexual revolution, but my argument actually, the human race actually had 5 sexual revolutions. And the life and teaching of Jesus, the Gospels, one of those sexual revolutions is the one that really helped people more than else, historically. So I don't appeal to any theological concepts or evidence. I look at the local record and see how Christianity has, that I've seen, and things that I've read about. I could talk about that all day, but I'm not going to do that because that's not the main topic you wanted today. But that's a brief description of what I've been working on there.
And a lot of your books before have been published. Harvest House. How about this one? I didn't know it just went up on Amazon.
I don't see it.
Are you able to hear me? You able to hear me?
I can hear you, but
Okay.
I can't. I can only see your face. I don't images.
Oh, you don't see my face. Okay, well, no problem. We'll just keep it moving here. So let's define this as we talk about it. Now that I think about it, spread by the sword. How would you define that phrase anyway? Spread by the sword. How would we define that?
Yeah, well, originally, Richard Carrier obviously didn't mean, a physical pointed piece of metal that you hold in people's hands. It's a more general, given a charitable reading, you'd say by force or by the threat of force.
Mm-hmm.
And by spread, it doesn't just mean that people become Christians because of force or the threat of force, because obviously, you didn't become Christian by being forced to believe in you.
Did I?
Yeah.
I did not. No.
Neither did I. That would be 0 to 2. There's 2 of us, and if we made people that way, we just took a survey of how many had been forced to believe in Christianity, then obviously the answer would be easy. It'd be easy to this question. Obviously, that's not true. Most people who became Christian did so in the last 200 years, and most of them did so willingly. I would say that spread by the sword means new cultural circles. Not so much consolidated, but the initial spread. So, for example, Christianity first spread around the Roman Empire, the Greco-Roman Empire, to the life of Jesus up until about 313 A.D., when Constantine made it illegal. For those first almost 300 years, Christianity not by the sword, but against the sword, against the force of air.
So prior to Constantine, no Christian swords involved.
I have not seen any of that. And if you go back to Jesus himself, of course, Jesus himself was probably the least manipulative salesperson of all time.
No doubt about that. Now, sociologist Rodney Stark has a book, The Rise of Christianity. You reference this in your work. It's pretty standard work to reference. And Carrier accuses you of reading this wrong, getting Stark wrong, it sounds like.
No, and then I explained, Rodney Stark agreed with me quite well. And in fact, he had read my Behind the New Atheism and gave it a thumbs up. I asked him about Rodney, and he said, this may sound a little mean, but he was kind of the old guy. He said basically, I had never heard of Rodney before you mentioned him, and 5 minutes after we talk, I'm going to forget I ever knew he existed.
Okay.
No, he was kind of a crusty old guy, but Stark shows very clearly that I have the quotes, in that article that show, not only in The Rise of Christianity, Stark was not a Christian at the time when he wrote that book. He also wrote the many other books describing the history of Christianity. That's somewhat rather controversial, but he definitely agreed in general. I mean, he described the nuances too of the Middle Ages, which I'm, trying to deny. But the point is, the very beginning, a religion can be defined in ways. It can be defined by the character and personality of the founder, It can be defined by the sacred scriptures of that religion and defined by developed tradition, what afterwards over many hundreds and thousands of years. So it depends on how you define Christianity in a sense. If you define Christianity by the personality and the teachings of Jesus, then the obvious answer is, of course, Christianity doesn't encourage people to force anyone to. In fact, Jesus is like I just said, he was a very low-key Savior. You know, foxes have holes, the Son of Man has no to lay his head. Take up your cross and follow me. You know, that hard sale, that is saying, actually, you have to think about this for, I'm not going to force you to believe. And Jesus never did. Then in the first 300 years, people basically followed that example. In the fourth century, Christianity had become fairly important in the empire, and Constantine himself was I don't know if he was or not, but he made Christianity legal and he privileged Christianity to a certain extent. But if you read biographies of Christians in the 4th century, when Christianity went from like 10% to, well over 50% of the Roman Empire, they don't describe any sort of force. Read St. Augustine's The Confessions, for example, and he describes the process by which he became a Christian. Ambrose or Jerome, or you read any of those church fathers, 4th century, there seems to have been, as far as I can tell, no compulsion to adopt Christianity that I've seen so far. If people come up with contrary examples, I'd be happy to take a look at them. But Christianity spread initially from 0 to 10% about 313 AD, and then from 10 to maybe 50%, mostly by natural growth. And during that period, it was only in like 80 or so AD that Christianity began to crack down on dissidents to a certain extent. And I believe that was a big mistake, and it was very much out of tune with original teachings and with his example. But it's also a very natural sociological phenomena. When a institution becomes powerful, it tends to do that sort of thing. Power corrupts. Corrupts absolutely. The character of Christianity, Rodney Stark emphasizes, and this is where Stark completely disagrees with what Carrier says. Christianity was much stronger when it peacefully and when there was no compulsion and it wasn't a top-down sort of thing. When it became a top-down sort of thing, the character of Christianity changed, and now you have people who pay their simony, they pay their way in order to get the job as a bishop or whatever office they're trying to achieve, and it's not necessarily for sincere purposes. It may be for making money or for power or for something like that. The character of Christianity changed fairly radically when Constantine made it legal, and then later on when Theodosius and other people made it not exactly compulsory, but very privileged. So a lot of historians would agree that something changed pretty radically by time. However, looking forward to Western history, up until the Middle Ages, I would say that this is probably the second best case for saying Christianity spread exactly by the sword, but by some degree of compulsion. However, it was as strong as Carrier claims it was. There were some, like I said, Constantine and whatnot, in which people were actually pretty much given the alternative, or you're dead. But it didn't happen often. And more often, the most common way of evangelism in those days was kind of a evangelism through marriage. A beautiful young princess would be offered to a king, not a Christian, and she would be a Christian, and he would marry her, and the whole country would be encouraged to adopt Christianity after that.
And of course, during the early days of Christianity, a lot of martyrs. Brian Lifton has a good little book, Early Christian Martyr Stories, so I encourage people to get. Now, a little bit older, from all the way back in 1967, but a scholar in this field, Martyrdom and Persecution in the Early Church, W.H.C. Friend. And let me show you something else he's got. It's the same title of the Stark book, but a different book, rather large, The Rise of Christianity, W.H.C. Friend. So a couple books if you want to go further in depth. But of course, today we're talking about David Marshall's article that he has up on his blog, Christ the Tao, Did Christianity Spread by the Sword? And I encourage you also to look at his new published work, Jesus Liberated Women. Good
How
stuff.
Jesus liberated women, yes.
Say what?
How Jesus has liberated women.
Yes, excellent. And So we talked a little bit about Christianity growing under persecution, what drove conversions, how after Constantine there was some corruption that came in because Christianity gained power, and state Christianity is a problem, so there was changes. And then when you look at the global history, you have some examples, probably the ones we started off with, where you can give a strong case, as it were, for the sword argument. And we talked about Latin America essentially being an exception to the rule. Where would you say, David Marshall, is the weakest case as far as this by the sword argument? Where's the weakest case you've seen people try to plant their flag?
Yeah, as an Asian scholar, as an Asia scholar, I shouldn't say Asian. I could tell you this history of Christianity in China, for example, and of Korea and Japan, and also in different smaller tribal peoples, in the hill tribes of East Asia and Papua New Guinea, the Polynesian peoples, the tribal peoples of Taiwan. Africa is a complicated case, but there Christianity mostly spread after the 19th century, was almost entirely freely. In fact, missionaries opposed depredations that were visited upon the African peoples. For example, Dingston, if you read his journal. Let me mention, in India, of course, in India, there was the one exception Goa that I know of. Generally speaking, Christianity was, even under the British at times, the British didn't necessarily want Christianity to spread. Sometimes they actually forbade it, for example, among some tribal peoples in East India. The missionaries, the people wanted to hear more about Christianity, and the local imperialists, they said basically no, that area. And sometimes the churches were burnt and people were persecuted, apparently by the British, is what I understand. But the thing about the spread of Christianity in much of Asia is because imperialism was happening at about the same time, Christianity suffered under a very great disadvantage. Because people tended to see the gospel as part and parcel of this European culture that was oppressing them, conquering them, and therefore kind of the worst of both worlds. They couldn't actually force people to believe, but people tended to associate message. For example, during the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, the people who suffered by the Boxer, tens of thousands of Christian believers, Chinese believers, because they thought that the West powers were oppressing China, conquering different parts of, and they blamed it on the people that came to hand, the people that they could access, and that was Chinese Christians and missionaries, and therefore killed tens of Chinese Christians and hundreds of missionaries as well. So during the Qing dynasty, even from the Tang dynasty in the 630s, when Christianity first arrived in China, there was a period of grace which the great Tang Taizong emperor was kind of favorable to Christianity. But down through the centuries, Christianity really faced an uphill struggle in most of the world in spreading, and especially, of course, from 1449, when the communists took over China, to the 1990s or 2000s, Christianity was suffering terrible persecution under the communists, and that's precisely when the gospel spread rapidly and grew from maybe 1 or 2 million to maybe 70 or 80 million or so Christians. So this is the opposite of Richard Carrier's thesis, when he says that Christianity only thrives when it is protected by the military or political power. In fact, that's not true at all.
So would you say, David Marshall, that the atheist version of history here is driven more by ideology, or would you say that it's driven by history?
Ignorance.
Primarily ignorance?
I don't want to say the atheist version of history, because obviously there's some atheist historians, and I'm not going to ascribe Carrier says to everybody else. I'm not going to blame everybody for what he says, but I don't think he knows very much world history, and I don't think people like that have really to see Christianity through the lens of just a few incidents and a few parts of the world. They're aware of how Constantine, what Constantine did. They know what uh, Charlemagne did, and they know some of these episodes in Central and South America, but they're not too aware of the rest of the story. And let me say something about that too, because an historian, I really don't like cherry picking, but I'm doing it all the time. And it's only fair to recognize that Christianity is not a religion that is spread, and different religions have different. I mean, there's not a single faith that hasn't done terrible things, because humans are human beings. And therefore, if you look at something like Buddhism, for example, Buddhism also generally did not spread by violence. But there were many violent incidents in the history of Buddhism, times when the monks went to war with one another. I would say that, generally speaking, Islam didn't always spread by the sword. There were places and times when it seemed to spread peacefully, but it was more typically spread through violent warfare than, say, Buddha example. So you can look at the different periods and phases of Islamic history, and you can say, generally speaking, it actually did, beginning with Muhammad, beginning with the caliphates. Excuse me a second, I need to add some juice to this.
Well, we don't want that to die. Listen, live chat, if you would like to come in and ask David a question, personally, I'm going to drop the link in there. You can ask your question. I'm going to pin it at the top here, and if you would like to jump on real brief and ask a question regarding this issue from David, you can, because now you have the link. And some of you are saying my voice sounds pitched up like a helium. I don't know why. It sounds normal in my headphones, but I did hear it when I listened to the playback, and it did have a strange tone. I don't know what's going on with that. Make sure you fill out the poll. What's the main way Christianity spread? Some people may not like the options here, but we got violence, force, compulsion, lies and trickery and such, evangelism, persuasion, truth, love, or a mix, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Right now, violence and force has 11%, a mix has 15%, and 75% evangelism and persuasion.
Lost the sound there.
Let's compare and contrast there with Christianity spreading, and also Buddhism and Islam, like you were saying.
Let me throw a couple other religions in the mix, and I know the word religion tendacious. Include Islam. I would include communism and Nazi and secular humanism as viable religions by my definition. And obviously, communism spread mostly by the sword, and so did Nazism to a certain extent. It was voted in 1933. Secular humanism, by and large, has spread through nation and through different peaceful methods. So, the objective, I think we should look at all of these different movements and see how they see Christianity by nature, which is defined, I would say, by the life of Jesus Christ and his teachings and his example. By it shouldn't spread through violence or force, but because things are what they are, I would say down through history there have been many periods in which, used, because we have what sociologists call a canopy. There's a tent over a society, and the rulers of a society want people to accept this covering, and therefore to accept a certain ideology. This is a very common phenomena, any part of it. So naturally, people who want to a society or an empire, they will naturally want to pick parts of that, an ideology that's going to help them better. And Christianity, you can use Christianity in that way if you like. Many people often have. You can see it in contemporary politics as well as you will find with any ideology.
I'm just trying to check on some of these sound levels. On my end. Okay, that's good as well. Live chat. What are your questions for Mr. David Marshall here? You can jump on, or you can do it through the live chat here. Aleph has a question. Let's see if I can. Aleph, you just left. Aleph, I had you. I literally just clicked you on. I was bringing you on, Aleph. Well, come back if you can, Aleph. Okay, there looks like he's back. Okay, awesome. Let's see here. Okay, Aleph, just give me 1 second here, and we'll see if we can hear you. There we go. Let me see. Bring this over here. And, all right, Aleph, what is your question for David Marshall? Aleph, you have muted yourself, and you left again. No, the name daughter on there says ALEF. That's actually for real. Okay. Well, I guess that was that. Okay. All right. So, if you want to ask a question, now is your chance to ask a question. Now, you wanted to set up a debate with Richard Carrier about this, right? And it never happened.
No, a couple debates on other subjects. I don't think I did one. Wasn't very satisfied with the second one. I thought it went a little bit better, but it was on difference. It was on the truth of Christianity or something like that.
Did you guys debate in writing, or how did that go down?
Well, we did some in writing, and then we had a public debate at the University of Alabama. That was actually my first time to be on the stage in the stage debate. I didn't think I did really well on that one. And the second one was in the Unbelievable program with Justin Brierley, and that one went a little different.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Yeah, is the Christian faith reasonable? And you're saying that was your first one. But the Unbelievable, I have to check that out as well. This is pretty cool. These go back.
Yeah, I really wouldn't recommend that.
I gotcha.
I needed a little just on that one.
Oh, with the other one on Unbelievable, you did the mythicist. You did the mythicist deal, right?
I don't recall exactly, but I wrote a book. I wrote a book called Jesus is No Myth: The Fingerprints of God on the Gospels. Mm-hmm. But the main point of my book was not that Jesus is not a myth, but that there is strong evidence for the history of the Gospels. So we were talking maybe a little bit cross purposes. Richard got a little frustrated and said some things that were extreme, but I'm not really, honestly, I don't take his position, Jesus mythicism, I don't take it seriously. I had bigger fish to fry.
Yeah, most scholars don't, of course, as the audience knows. Speaking of the audience, make sure you guys come back tomorrow on the channel here, Street Apologists Live. We're going to do some great programming with a gentleman who's been defending the faith for 50 years, and it should be quite a fascinating program. I'm looking forward to it. Talking about the presence of African Christians in the Scripture, Black presence in the Scripture revealed. Dr. Walter McCrae, he has a number of books on the topic. And even if you're thinking, well, I'm not so sure about that, just tune in tomorrow and find out. I think you will like it. And then on Saturday, we're going to do ICGJC, Israelite Church of God in Jesus Christ, officer of 100 named Napash Amath. He's going to talk about why he left after 19 years in the ICGJC Hebrew Israelite cult. And it'll be very, very fascinating. Okay, so what is next for Mr. David Marshall? We talked about what's next for our show.
The gentleman who said something about being mostly Cherokee also, who I think he talked about the Trail of Tears or something like that, and maybe made a reference. I really was sorry to hear that. I really felt it's really heartbreaking as a Christian to see when people so completely misunderstand the gospel as they feel they need to force it down people's throats. Reprehensible, and it's very hard, when people do that sort of thing, most of us have to try to live it down, and in 2,000 years we really can't. And one bad testimony like that, one bad example can ruin, a little bit of one turnip in a pot of soup is going to ruin the whole soup. Okay, so what is next? Well, I'm still working on this, got the second volume coming out, which will take the story forward through the life of Jesus and how the gospel has led women in Europe, and then through the world. Basically, I concentrate on India, China, Japan, Buddhist countries, parts of Africa, and tell how the gospel has, not only education and hospitals, but even things like, girls who were forced to were burnt to death after their husbands died in India, for example, a phenomenon called sati. And in China, where girls had their feet crushed as little girls, maybe 7, 8 years old, so that they would, it was called binding. 缠足, 小脚, as they say in Chinese. And they would have their feet bound very tightly, and part of it was to probably make them look a little more sexy to their lovers when they grew older, and they become real ladies that way. Christianity helped women in so many different ways that my students, for example, my Peking University students, the fact that they education, the fact that they could walk around China and Instagram pictures and photos of the scenery because they're on both their feet. Then the gospel helped women in many different ways like that. But then there were counter-revolutions because human beings are very complicated, and an ancient mythology often perceived God of love or the God of sex as being more powerful even than heaven. So human beings, on the one hand, it's with, forcing people, power and sex. They're very natural, very central, dynamic forces within human nature. The gospel doesn't wipe our operating system clean, so they really blank slates, and then we just filled with purity and love and kindness. These things, there keeps on coming back. The things that the gospel has spoken out against. Oh, okay. It's an everlasting struggle, and so after Jesus created women in many different ways, there were counter revolutions such as Islam, Mormonism, and different philosophy. Simone de Beauvoir's third wave, for example, and new forms of misogyny, like Andrew Tate, and who really seemed to hate women. Because Christianity had such a profound effect on the human race and did to liberate and empower women. That wasn't the end of the story. So I'm telling the rest of it in the second volume of How Jesus Has Liberated Women, and I'm sitting on that a little bit, but it's pretty much finished.
Wow. It's interesting, you have an interesting perspective because not as many people are well-versed in the Eastern side of things as you are with the language, and you were doing missions there and have done a lot of teaching in the East, especially China, right?
Yes. As a man, I was trying to help girls who had been forced into prostitution, not directly, but more consciousness raising, goes for local newspapers and speaking in churches and things like that. Then later on, I got into education. I've been founded a international high school in China, and then most recently I've been teaching at Peking University in Beijing as an educator. So yeah, I've been doing, and I love Chinese culture. And right now, I look at the situation between China and America, and the dangers and the problems. This is one of the biggest challenges that we face in the model: is how are these two superpowers going to get along, or are they not going to get along, and something that is going to happen. So I've also thought a little bit about writing a book on this subject.
Oh, wow. That'd be very fascinating to see. Now, the whole time, I guess I should have been calling you Dr. David Marshall. You have a PhD. Sorry about that. I don't know if that's a requirement. What did you get your PhD in a related field?
Yes, my PhD is in the relationship between Christian and Chinese culture.
Ah, very related.
So my thesis, the gospel fulfills the deepest truths in Chinese culture. Because I'm such a lover of China, I've traveled all over China, read their literature, I've visited temples, interviewed so many people. For me, kind of one of the main moments of, what's the word? The old word from the Greek verse.
Eureka?
Eureka. Yeah, that's it. Eureka.
Yeah.
The Eureka movement came in 1984 when I visited the Altar of Heaven in Beijing, and I realized that God had already been in China for a long time before there. And I've been researching that ever since. That's, 42 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And it's not become any less fascinating and fun since then.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, Dr. David Marshall, please tell the audience where to find you at online.
Where to find me at online? Gee, I don't know. I'm not really that much online, honestly, except for my Amazon, and some of those are difficult to
So
find too.
put in David Marshall on Amazon and find those books.
Well, you'll find a few other deals. There's David Marshalls like to write books in general.
Is that right? Well, I
There's
see you
actually
got
several.
True Son of Heaven, How Jesus Has Liberated Women, The Truth Behind the New Atheism, Knowing Jesus, Knowing God, How Jesus Passes the Outsider Test, Anonymous.
Well, the knowing Jesus, knowing God isn't mine. That must be somebody else. And there was a David
Sorry,
Marshall
that's
wrote
weird.
about
It's
his
right
one.
there.
Like I
Oh,
said, there's lots of David
fascinating.
Marshalls,
Okay.
but the rest of them are all mine. Was True Son of Heaven, How Jesus Fulfills the Chinese, and that has an updated version, which is just a few years old.
Jesus and the Religions of Man, Why the Jesus Seminar Can't Find Jesus, and Grandma Marshall Could, and the newest work, How Jesus Has Liberated Women, Volume 1, Before Christ. Good stuff. Thank you for joining us here today on Street Apologist Live, my friend.
Thank you very much. It was great talking with you.